Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. Thanks so much for listening. This is Adam Huss coming to you from California. And thanks especially to those of you who continually support this podcast. It is an honor and such a pleasure to be able to do this. If you would like to support, things like donations and subscribing to our Patreon make this podcast literally possible. And the links for those ways that you can support are always in the show notes. Even just leaving a great review or telling somebody about this podcast helps it to reach more people. Also, I'd love to connect with you personally. If you feel like dropping me a line, you can do so at connect@organicwinepodcast.com. Now, this is a pretty epic conversation with David Bos. That's one S, B-O-S, of Bos Wines in Michigan. So I'm going to keep this intro short, and I want to thank Andrew Backlund of Centralas Wines for connecting me with Dave. Dave is a fantastic ambassador for Michigan wine, and yet he spent more than a decade growing and making wine organically and biodynamically in Napa Valley first. So his enthusiasm seems well informed, and I hope you find it as infectious as I did. Seen through Dave's eyes, Michigan sounds pretty exciting. And even more exciting, to me at least, is that Dave is a fantastic ambassador for biodynamic and organic viticulture. So this conversation is loaded. Enjoy. Dave, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
I am so excited to be on your podcast. Your podcast is such an important resource for people. So thank you for all you do and all you bring to the podcast universe.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I mean, it's funny. I want to give a shout out to your friend, Jim Duane, as well, because, he was an inspiration and how I first heard about you years ago, actually, when I was just, trying to learn about everything I could learn about. And, we're not like, I don't know Jim personally, but we've emailed a few times, and his you've got, for anybody listening who wants to learn more about you, 3 fantastic podcasts at least, right? 3, I think, with him. Yep. On the Inside Winemaking podcast. So shout out to him, and to you for spreading the word. So that's awesome.
He is celebrating 10 years of podcasting, and I think that is so commendable in a world where I feel like a lot of people want to do a podcast and they start doing it and they don't realize how much work it is. So I understand how much work you put into these podcasts. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. No, that's great. Well, what's great about you is you have this now diversity of exposures to very different contexts in terms of farming and making wine. But before we jump into that, can you talk about what your history is? Like, I'd love to just hear what all your experience is and everything, especially for people who haven't heard.
Absolutely. I have to give a quick shout out. We just had a 2-day event here called Dirt to Glass that Amanda Danielson and Michigan State University puts on. So if anyone's listening to this that is in the Midwest and wants to learn more about Midwest viticulture and farming and all the good stuff, it is such a great event. This is the 3rd year they've done it, and I am so impressed. I would put it up against anything anyone's doing anywhere. It's that quality of speakers, that quality of information. And our friend Hannah was there. So she wanted me to tell you that she misses all your good vineyard energy. And she came to our wine garden in Elk Rapids where her and her mom came, and we were talking, and I convinced her, I'm like, you got to come to this thing. And she went to it on Thursday, made some great connections, and man, she's gonna my goal is to make sure she stays in Michigan. So for her any really good jobs, because we need her energy in Michigan.
we're still in the required state of mourning since she left. So
absolutely.
She's definitely gonna be the future of Michigan for sure. I think if she stays there, which I think she wants to too. I mean, it's funny, we had this conversation about all these things, and after I was thinking about like the idea of going to get a ton of experience, it's always great to travel around, and as a young wine person to see different contexts and see what different people are doing and have this breadth. You can do stage and wherever, Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, Europe, South America, wherever. And then I was like, but honestly, like Michigan seems really exciting to me. A developing wine region that's like just got a whole lot of stuff going on and your influence there, you're at the beginning of something, like you could actually help build what's happening there. You can shape the direction of it. And I think that really excited her because she wanted to stay close to home anyway. So
Well, and,
yeah.
Amanda Danielson and Paolo Sabatini, who's with Michigan State, they started this Dirt to Glass thing, and we were talking last night over obviously a couple glasses of wine, and it was so cool. Adam, you would have loved the diversity in the audience. Also, like I love it when like half the people are younger than me, because I'm like, that is the future of farming has to be younger, you know.
Ah,
And I
so cool.
loved I just loved the event for that too. It's attracting the right people that are young and eager and want to like change the world of farming, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Is how do we
Yeah.
do it? We do it one vineyard at a time, 1 acre at a time. And my background is I was an English writing and religion double major, graduated from Hope
Oh
College.
my God.
Yeah,
Do
fell in
you
love.
know that that's kind of what my degree
Really?
was? Yeah, I
What?
started as an English major and switched to religion. I just ended with a degree in religion because I got sick of doubling. But yeah,
No,
I was
that's
like, I just didn't like my English classes. They were all like, read these books and then discuss with a bunch of other, people who don't know anything. I was like, I could just do that by myself. Thank you.
well,
I'll just,
that's why I switched to English writing, because I'm like, I want to be a poet.
oh yeah. And I went for writing. I mean, that's what I went for. I went to the University of Iowa because of their writing program. Yeah.
They have a great writing program. I
Yeah.
looked at
Where'd you go? Did you go to Ann Arbor?
No, I went to Hope College, small little
Oh,
school in Michigan. It's great though,
okay.
and great writing professors. So it was great. And yeah, graduated college. I'm like,
Beautiful.
oh, I want to go get an MFA, and I'm like, oh wait, I'm not a good enough writer. Anyone wants to pay me to do this? I'd already fallen in love with wine in college at a restaurant, so I moved to Chicago, worked at a high-end contemporary French restaurant, and I realized I wanted to get on the production side. So I moved up to Traverse City in '03 and '04, worked at Chateau Grand Traverse, which is the oldest and biggest one of the biggest wineries up here. Worked with Sean O'Keefe, who's now at Mari Vineyards. And it was great. 2004, I was 20 something, and he just like opened up the world, and he and Baron, the winemaker, just showed me a bunch of things. So also worked at Stella Restaurant, because when you make no money in the wine industry, you better have two jobs, right? And Stella was a great
Yeah.
experience too, because Amanda, the world of Italy just opened up to me. And then in 2005, moved out to Napa. I knew I had to go get more experience. The wine industry was even smaller back then in Michigan 20 years ago.
Mm,
And moved out to California and kept looking for the right job. And I already realized that I wanted to get into biodynamic farming, because and I didn't know much about it. All I knew is my favorite producers were doing it. And like back then in the Wine Bible or any book you look at, there'd be either a picture of Nicholas Jolie or cow horns, and it would just talk about like following moon cycles, and these wines are really rad. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
there's no good information 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Still, we'll go over some of my favorite books at some point, because I do want to point people in the right direction. But
Yeah, please. Yeah.
yeah, so got a job at Gergich Hills working in the vineyards, and they were in the process of transitioning to organic and biodynamic farming. So I had a really unique opportunity to work with a great winery that was looking the right direction probably before most people.
Yeah.
And they paid for me to take classes at Davis and Napa Valley College, and I studied with a bunch of different biodynamic farmers and practitioners. So I was there for 9 years, and it was an amazing experience, great family. And I just was able to learn a ton quickly, and then also be able to do experiments and meet so many amazing people in Napa Valley. Like I have so many great friends there that are doing biodynamics at a high level that it's fun to go back and visit.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, I was just there and met with, I got to tour with Evo, the vineyards. Really didn't
Yeah.
even go to the winery or the tasting room or anything like that. We just literally went to spend an hour walking around with him and hearing about that and
Well,
seeing
you're down in American Canyon, because Hannah and I were talking about this, and
yeah.
I was there before that garden or the biodynamic shed was there or any of that stuff. And it was so cool to be a part of that and have somebody like Evo be like, you know what, sky's the limit. Let's go.
Yeah.
Like he is, he jumps into everything with 2 feet. And in the biodynamic world, he has helped so many people get to where they need to get to. And it was so awesome. And we're going to get there too about two different routes in which people get to biodynamic farming, but just
Yeah.
being a place for people to come and see how it's done and what it looks like.
I mean, yeah, it's, if you haven't been I don't know when the last time you were there, but it's really grown in. It's beautiful. There's guinea hens and ducks roaming around and
Oh
swimming
yeah.
in the ponds, and it's gorgeous. So like, yeah, little
Best thing about
beautiful.
guinea hens when we introduced guinea hens, that little like Blue Stream Creek that runs through it. Uh,
Yeah.
as soon as we had guinea hens, my dog and I stopped getting ticks, which was a really nice treat to know.
Yep.
If you have tick problems, guinea hens, they're loud, but man, they're very good at eating ticks and they're delicious.
Yep. Yeah. That's awesome. So then from Gurgich, you were there, what, like 13 years or
I
something?
was there 9 years. I was in Napa
9 years.
13. So
Okay, got
uh,
it.
my wife and I started Boss Wine in 2010 with just 2 barrels of Phoenix Ranch Syrah. And I had already started kind of consulting on the side. And so I left Gurgich, continued to consult for them, and started consulting for other people in Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino, while also running a bunch of small vineyards that helped build our small wine brand because we don't have any rich aunts or uncles, so it's
Yeah.
you know 2010 was a long time ago, and we just opened our tasting room in Elk Rapids, the Boss Wine Garden 3 years ago, and everyone's like, "Oh, you're new." I'm like, "Well, depending on how you look at it, sure."
Yeah.
I might
Yeah.
be
Well,
in
it
my
sounds
life.
like you picked a good time to leave Napa. We were, that was the other kind of bracing thing about being there recently was just like people are kind of reeling. Like it's a different landscape in
So
terms
we
of,
left in 2017 in the spring. I
okay.
spent some backyard cab vineyards to make our Deo Napa Valley cab. I flew back to pick because I was convinced I had to do everything myself. And I flew back for the 2017 fires. I kid you not. I
Ah,
picked two vineyards and woke up the next morning and the Napa Valley was on fire. And it was the most heartbreaking thing for me because I didn't live there anymore. Like it was such a juxtaposition of feelings and thoughts that
mm,
I'm not even sure I still process it, to be honest. But I think looking at Napa and always thinking that moving to Michigan, I'm like, oh, when we have the cold vintages, when we lose crop, I'll always be able to lean on California. And I've had, two bad vintages in Napa and 7 good ones in Michigan.
yeah.
It's
I
a
mean,
difference than what I thought.
yeah, there's I mean, I want to ask you about that, but I'll just throw out there. I literally just finished a book as I drove down from the ranch. I'm in LA right now, and I work up 5 hours north in at Piscinus Ranch, and
Which is amazing, by the way. I've watched
yeah, yeah,
it.
yeah,
Hannah's
and
like,
the I
Hannah's like, how do you know that? I'm like, well, Kelly used to run sheep in Carneros, and he was, forward thinking
yeah,
20 years ago. So now he's just 40 years ahead of all of us.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a unique vineyard. It really is. Yeah, it's pretty cool. In that sense, for sure. Like just the idea that went into like designing it, is pretty amazing. And as I drove down yesterday, I finished this book called Fire Weather by John Valiant, and highly recommend it. And as I'm listening to it, it's basically about like, what you'd expect, like the vicious cycle of increased fossil fuel burning, leading to increased temperatures, leading to increased fires, which leading to increased temperatures, and basically like year-round threat around the world now for places that never burned before are now burning. And it's, once that starts happening, it just increases, because like you're putting so much carbon and heat into the atmosphere every time one of those fires happens that it makes it more prone to fires. As I'm driving down, I pass a wildfire on the other side of the highway in the Grapevine that was literally so hot I could feel like the side of my car heating up. I could feel the heat through the window.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. I mean, like, the other. I saw like I was like, I was like 100 yards from it, is what it felt like. And the fire, like the whole other side of the freeway was blocked off, and people were running up. I mean, the firefighters are running up like in a line, like at the edge of the burn area, like trying to control the flames, which were pretty intense. And I'm literally listening to like the closing chapter of Fire Weather as I'm listening to this, which
Right.
anyway, surreal and yet not at all, because it just felt like, yeah, this is a reality that we all need to kind of come to grips with. But you saying that about Napa being on
We
fire,
should have come to
yeah,
grips with it earlier, but
yes, yeah, yeah,
now it's better than never.
Yeah, this book, I mean, this book also just sort of details the history of, we started talking about this. The government started talking with oil companies, with fossil fuel companies about this in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. All was known. And so everything that happened since then was just absolute, intentional, yeah, lying,
Yeah.
essentially. Everything that's happened since then has been knowing what was happening, what they were doing, full consciousness, full awareness.
Well, I will tell you, um, it's fully aware to me that we are the problem, but I also think we could be the solution. And I think that's where when people
Good
want to
segue.
no, but you know what I mean. Like it's not.
Yeah.
Like, we could talk 20 more minutes on the things I'm seeing in farming that are extremes and all that. And I look at it and go, wow, Steiner was right. We're doing this work so the earth can be healed. And no time in history has it needed it more than now.
Yeah.
And I love that line. And I think as people start paying attention to what they eat and drink more, like they have in the last decade, and kind of paying more attention to the world around us and, uh, how we farm and what we're going to do to kind of reverse this, it has to start with farming. I, you
Yep.
know, I want the government to do all the things it needs to do, but like we got to have a paradigm shift in how we look at farming and how we look at health and how we look at where we want to get to, or we're not going to do it fast enough.
Yeah. Yep. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you transitioned, even though you've been making wine, like you're kind of coming at it from the vineyard, you're
Yes.
thinking about it from that direction. And so having spent that time in Napa, you then moved back to Michigan and started a whole thing there. And I would love to hear about that, like what the differences and similarities are between those two contexts and what you've experienced and what you've learned. And I mean, we could probably talk the rest of the time just about that, but just to get you started, like, yeah,
Well,
what
I
what,
know it's
what
very
did you see?
opening a bottle of our method. I recall that I know you have in your glass.
Yes, I've been sipping it, like trying to, I mean, I'm just enjoying it at this point, not
I
even
was
like
staring at it.
thinking about it.
It's noon in Michigan. I get to have some wine. Yeah.
It's
So,
9 in LA. I get
hey,
to have some wine.
well, the irony is when I lived in California, I said it just needs to be noon in Michigan, and then when I moved to Michigan, I'm like, I guess that's noon in Nova Scotia, or Um,
Noon somewhere on the continent.
yes,
Right.
exactly. So I think, yeah, moving to Michigan 7 years ago, and we were in Napa. We started our wine label. My wife Jackie and I were looking at where did we want to move, where both our family and our business could thrive. And we're looking up and down the West Coast, and we had some good friends from Virginia in that were in our wine club and talking about the Virginia wine scene. And we talked about Texas and Michigan. They left, and my wife goes, "What about Traverse City?" I'm like, "I could move tomorrow. You know this." We'd go up every summer, and we started investigating, and it was like, yes, this is where we want to move to. And the two big things, Adam, like when people call and they want to like do podcasts or interviews, I'm like, I need to be upfront with you. I care about world-class wine and changing farming. So if you want to talk about those two things, great. If you want to talk about marketing wine and selling wine, yes, I do that, but that's not like the thing I want to talk about. And I think Michigan is at a place where 7 years ago when I moved here, I had several people tell me you can't do organic farming in Michigan. And I looked at them and I go, I don't know how to do anything else, right? Like I didn't have a conventional farm system. I went to Gergich and we transitioned right away. So like when people talk about frac codes and stuff, I'm like, I don't even know what those are, you know? And in the last 7 years, and this is one of the things at Dirt to Glass that I was talking to everybody about is Michigan has gone greener. We're just really bad at marketing it, right? Like one of
Mm,
the AVs up here, Old Mission Peninsula, and then there's Leelanau Peninsula. Old Mission Peninsula, 2/3 of the peninsula doesn't use Roundup anymore. But if you go to the tasting rooms, you wouldn't hear them say that. And I'm like, you guys, we have to promote this shades of green. I get it. I'm on the far end of the spectrum. I'm going to be as biodynamic as possible every chance I get. But I want you guys all to start moving towards this direction because we have to. Not
yeah.
because we want to or not because you should, because we have to. And watching people make these transitions over the last decade has been really cool because I was helping some of my friends came out to Napa. Brian Albrecht from Lawfoot Charlie came out a decade ago and was looking at clemenses, right? And so when I got here, I helped people set up under the row cultivation, and now we're talking about different mowers and all the regenerative ag stuff too. And it's like, hey, regenerative ag is great, but you have to have a healthy vine, and you have to be looking at how to do that, right? And so this last 2 days, it was so cool going around and looking at vineyards that I hadn't been to for a while, and people were doing the thing that they said they were doing, and it was really cool to see, because this is the future of Michigan farming, is organic and biodynamic. And if we can be the greenest place in the Midwest, we're going to attract the best talent for vineyards and winemaking. We're going to attract the best clients and consumers, and we're going to attract the best people that want to come up and eat and drink well, right? And we already have a lot of people, a lot of small farms doing, like friends of mine have Up North Heritage Farm. They're doing organic, grass-fed, no soy, Mangalisa pigs and chicken and beef. And then, there's a bunch of organic gardens and like organic farms up here that are just outstanding. And so it, by no means is it just me, right? Like it's already been like an undercurrent, but now it's becoming a true wave, right? Now it's like, hey, this wave is coming, and you can either help create it, ride it, or you're going to get hit by it. So figure out which one you want to be, because it's really cool too to see. I work with 5 small farmers, and they're all non-certified organic, and most of them are non-certified biodynamic. And talking to one of the growers that was most concerned about like going organic in the spray program. And granted, our grapes aren't in yet. We got a month to go, buddy. We're like just getting into Verasion, where I'm sure you guys are already picking.
I just picked my backyard grapes this morning, some of them anyway.
Yes, but exactly. So we're not to the finish line, and we're at the bottom of the 7th, and it's looking good. But Mother Nature still gets to bat last, right? And but walking this vineyard with this farmer friend of mine, and it's so cool to watch people see great results happen in their vineyards, because all my vineyards are between 1 and 5 acres, and they're all ran by people that truly love what they do. So it's not a job. For most of them, it's a hobby, and it's a hobby that they put their whole heart into, right? So like, I want to make sure that I'm getting the best quality, and I want their vines to be the healthiest they've ever been. And we're getting there. And it's been so cool to see over the last 5 years of working with these farmers how much progress we've made. And I think that's the thing that I keep telling people is great farming is not a once done act. You have to continue to look at your vineyard and your farm is it getting better or worse, right?
Yeah.
Is the world getting better or worse, right? Like you were talking about that book, like it's been getting worse for a while, right? Like, so what can we do on the farm to make it get better, right? Composting, cover crops, animals, going organic with your spray programs, introducing biodynamics, biodiversity, a lot of talk about native cover crops that are, bee friendly, that people are starting to plant in their vineyards. And it's just an exciting time to be in Michigan right now, and watching so many people do so well.
Yeah. I don't know if you have this sense, but so I don't know if you know this, but I just got some land in upstate New York where I'm intending to put in a little vineyard. It's sort of in the Finger Lakes area, not in the lakes, but just south of the lakes. I think it's within the AVA, but anyway, it's at the edge of it if it is.
We're in March.
Say again?
Whereabouts? I was just out there in March, so I'm familiar with the area.
Oh, it's about 20 minutes south of Ithaca in a little town called Spencer.
Oh, yeah. I saw that on the map, but we didn't get down that far. But I
love it. If you know Eve's Cidery, it's really close to Eve's Cidery.
I had some of that cider. I did not make it down there. I have had I love Fred from Weimer. And so we spent
I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Like he went through the nursery. He gave me the keys to his vineyards. I walk the vineyards every morning, and like, they are just extremely impressive. And we went to a lot of other great wineries in the Finger Lakes, but like, it was so fun for me to be able to.
Well, he's doing biodynamic. I think he's the only certified biodynamic, right?
I think he is. And I know Nova's doing some. I know a couple other people are doing it. I just don't know if they're certified yet. Right. But yeah, that's a great community if you're going to plant grapes and, be in like an area with people doing awesome things,
Yeah. There's a lot of great resources there and a lot of great people. Yeah. That's what I'm finding as well. And
so what do you think of the method that you have in your glass right now?
Oh, I love it. And what I was going to say, I want to be thoughtful about that, but to finish my thought was like, and this was kind of the question that I was leading for you, was the thing that I find, east of the Mississippi is that like, there are vines that are like weeds, like they're growing wild around the property. Like you don't have to create an ecosystem to enable grapes to flourish. They are already there and they're flourishing. And you know what I mean? I don't know if you're seeing that in Michigan, but like to me, I had this sense of like, there just seems to be a lot more input necessary for vines to survive in California in a lot of the contexts where they're grown versus where you are. It's almost like they want to be there anyway. Like they're already there,
Yeah.
I
Oh, for
don't know
sure.
if you're,
I
yeah,
There's three different spots where I stop where there's wild grapevines, and I use them as indicator plants for me
yeah,
because they are ahead of any of the vinifera hybrids that I'm working with.
yeah,
And there's one spot on Old Mission where these native grapevines I've never seen a sign of downy mildew, powdery mildew, and they're just wild, right? Like it's just crazy to look at these things and be like, they have this vine is extremely healthy.
yeah,
Um, and I did at one point taste the fruit, and I'm like, the fruit is gross, so I don't actually want to propagate this, but like, it's just really curious to me. And the other two spots will always show me what's on the horizon as far as disease pressures that I need to be looking for in our vineyards. And
yeah,
so I always urge everyone, I'm like, hey, go for a hike, figure out a couple spots where you have wild vines growing in Michigan, because they're going to be great helps for you understanding what might be coming in your vineyard or what to look for. Like you don't have to have a master's in viticulture to understand once you see some of these diseases what they look like, right, and what they can do. And a lot of talk at the conference this week was about, hey, my vines don't show that stress anymore. It's like, well, when you have healthier vines, mildew doesn't take off like wildfire, right? If you're not
yeah,
spraying a bunch of nasty chemicals on them, right? What happens is they just become more resilient by nature because they're stronger and healthier, just like people, right? If you're
yeah,
feeling, if you're eating well and working out and sleeping well, guess what? You're less likely to get a cold than somebody who's not doing those things. And grapevines there is no perfect grapevine, first off. And I think that's where people have to realize that, like, hey, there's no matter what you plant, wherever you plant it, you're going to have to work with the vine. And that's the beautiful part about being a farmer is you're part of the process, right? Um, and I can't say enough about that because I think so often people are like, hey, I want to do less. It's like, well, do less intentionally, but do the things you have to do with even more intention, right? And so when I look at these wild grapevines, it's so fun to like then go to the vineyards and see, like one of the things that I've been pushing MSU on is since I've taken a couple of large vineyards, Mari and now Modalis down the Southwest, organic, and then all my small growers organic. Um, Sour rot's a huge issue in Michigan, and none of the organic vineyards have it. And even one of Brian's Albrecht's vineyards went organic, and he asked me, well, he and a bunch of growers are like, "What'd you spray?" I'm like, "No, I didn't. It's what I didn't spray." Right.
right,
And that lack of sour rot is a huge deal for Michigan when we get into um, that that idea of getting into harvest and not needing to sort out things that are rotten, right? Like
yeah,
you can live with a little botrytis, but you can't live with a little sour rot. And so we're just seeing some of those things in Michigan viticulture right now that can't always be explained, but I know why it's working.
yeah,
Like I can't tell you what people are spraying that's causing them to have sour rot, but undoubtedly it's a breakdown. When you're spraying some of these chemicals that are getting into the vines, you're breaking down the cuticle, you're breaking down their natural ability to, have thicker skins, have better
yeah.
constitution in the cluster itself.
I mean, it
And
could,
so, like, I
yeah, it
just
could be many things, right? It could be like,
yeah,
you're sort of relieving them of the job of doing the thing that they would normally do themselves. And so that lowers their resistances because they're reliant, they've become reliant on these chemicals. Or it could be like, especially if they're using herbicides, they could be just that, they're not getting the nutrition that they should be getting because herbicides are, messing up that soil ecology for them. And yeah,
oh yeah, the as soon as you go away from herbicides or pre-emergence, like you can see a drastic improvement in the vine themselves. And I think
yeah,
it's been really cool from that few people that said you can't do organic farming here. Like one of them is now doing biodynamic farming, which is awesome. And a bunch of other people are starting to go, okay, this is a quality minded concept that I have to pay attention to, because even if you're a farmer and you don't want to pay attention to it, guess what, like grapes are not a commodity. Like people are getting more money for organic grapes in Michigan. So guess what? Like if you want to make more money and you want me as also somebody who sells wine, people that I want to sell wine to want an authentic story, a true story. They want to buy into what you're doing, and what we're doing is really cool. So there's room on the boat for everyone. So hop on, let's go.
Yeah. I'm gonna now respond more thoughtfully about the method agricole. Super peachy. I was like, this to me, if I didn't know better, I would think it was sparkling muscat with something else in there. Like there's a finish that's almost, I mean, it's like super floral, I think, as well. There's like a finish that's I don't know, it almost reminds me like you infused it with some floral or something like that, like a mead type situation. How do you make this? Like, what is this?
So this is the one I wanted to send you several of our wines, but I knew immediately from listening to your podcast, this is the one that you're going to gravitate towards.
Yeah, I loved it.
And I hope I wasn't judging you too harshly on that, but
I'm weird. Yeah. Is that what you're trying to say? I'm weird.
Well, if you would have told me that I was going to make a sparkling pet nat from a hybrid called Velvet Musquet and add a little Pinot Blanc a decade ago when I lived in Napa, I would have laughed at you, because most pet nats I had back then were like just flawed and blew up on me. And secondly, like I didn't know anything about hybrids because I lived in Napa, right? Like I was trying to get people to think about Syrah, let alone like something way off on in right field. This vineyard is about 30 to 40 minutes southwest of Traverse City. And if you're listening to this, pull up a map of Traverse City. We have Lake Michigan, two big deep bays. East Bay goes down to 680. Deepwater Point is 680 feet deep. We have Elk Lake and Torch Lake, which are both over 300 feet deep. Lake Leelanau is not deep, but it is a huge lake. So these bodies of water and being on the 45th parallel allow us to grow grapes here, right? 45th parallel, everyone thinks Bordeaux or Oregon, but it's also like Montana and Mongolia, right? Like you need the water, you can't do what we're doing. Like Chicago's 250 miles south of us, and they'll get snow before us every fall because these waters stay warm in the fall and allow us to pick all the way through October and sometimes into November.
Yeah.
Now, those waters get cold, so our springs are 3 or 4 weeks behind Chicago, right?
Yeah.
So late,
and you can get some pretty gnarly snows there too, right? I mean, I know like Buffalo gets the lake, what they call the lake effect, and they'll get like 4 feet of snow and shut down the city.
Yeah, we'll get some good snow, but because the water, if it doesn't, the bays don't freeze. And people think, well, it's only like 38, 40 degrees. It's like, well, that's enough to keep the temperature of the air warmer. So like when Chicago had that Snowmageddon a few years ago, it was like negative 40 or whatever. It was 6 degrees or 4 degrees up by us. And that's good enough for even vinifera to grow, right?
Yeah.
And we have sandy loam limestone soils. I don't know if you listen to Brenna Quigley's Roadside Terroir. She and my friend Rebecca from Quintessa came to visit a couple years ago, and I get so excited when people visit. We're running around the vineyards and grabbing lunch, and it was about lunchtime where I'm like, oh wait, why are you guys here? like why are you guys in Michigan? It took me forever because I'm a little dense. And Brenna grew up in the UP, and she is a geologist, so she had so much to add. And we're running around, and it's all sandy loam limestone on Old Mission and most of Leelanau. I'm like, we have limestone soils here. This is amazing, right? Like it's sandy loam, which we also need because it's well drained. It helps the vines during wintertime, helps the vines during summertime because it gets warmer. All the things that kind of make the place unique is the water and the soil. And this vineyard is situated like 40 minutes inland on a ridge by Interlaken, which is a kind of famous music academy, but a little south of there. And I'm in this vineyard 7 years ago with the farmer. And I'm like, how can you grow grapes here? We walk up to the top and I'm like, oh, I'm on a big ridge. Of course you can grow grapes up here, And he planted Velvin because it ripens early and buds out late. And it's a clone from Cornell. You'll see it in the Finger Lakes. I saw a bunch of it, not a bunch, but enough of it when I was out there. But it has a virus, so no one's planting it. The virus just slows the ripening, right? And it's delicious at like 14 bricks. So it doesn't like, I don't need, it to get to 24. I usually pick it when it tastes good right around like 18, 19. And the first year I made it into a still wine and I loved it. And we still make that occasionally when we can. But I wanted to make it sparkling because I'm like, oh, this is delicious. Lower acid, great aromatics, right? And I do blend a little Pinot Blanc into it to add a little more structure. But the thing with this wine is I'm like, this is just a fun wine, and I'll never be done exploring all the amazing places you can grow grapes in northern Michigan or even
so
south.
This is a Muscat, but it's a hybrid Muscat.
Yes. So
That's amazing.
if you Google it, it's 86% vinifera, which is one of
Right.
the things that can't be self-rooted. And like I haven't like researched it enough, but I have no doubt they were trying to make, something that could compete with like that you could plant and try to make a Moscato out of, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
the original thought, if I'm guessing. But I look at it and go, why not make it dry? I do a light filtration on this just because I do sell it to restaurants and I can't have them blowing up, but it's a light filtration. And then I don't aim for champagne bubbles, so it's probably 3 atmosphere or something like that. So it's just the bubbles are just meant to lift the wine. So like even if this wine goes still, like if you have it in the fridge and a couple days later you go to it and it's flat, it's still delicious.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it was open overnight. I had it last night, like I told you, and having it this morning. Still bubbly this morning too, by the way,
Yeah,
and nice, beautiful. Yeah, and even, I mean, it's sitting in my glass a while. It's maybe going a little less sparkly, but still delicious. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Muscat. Like I made one of my most popular wines was a Muscat with prickly pears, and it's prickly pear season right now in LA, so it's kind of exciting. I just made like a um, prickly pear agua fresca yesterday. I'm thinking of using this wine to make my version of a mimosa, but using prickly pear juice with this, and I'm probably going to blow my own.
that sounds delicious, by the
It
way.
sounds incredible. I'm like salivating thinking about it right now. This is yeah, that's really cool. I mean, is it? Do you know what the what the strengths of it being a hybrid are? Is it cold hardiness or
Most of the
mildew
Cornell ones
tolerance?
Most of the Cornell ones are somewhat cold hardy. Usually, Minnesota has like the really cold hardy ones, like Marquette.
Right.
You a carbonic
Yeah.
Marquette, which will come out. I'll get you a bottle of that because it's full 100% carbonic. And I feel like right now with hybrids in Michigan, they get a bad rap, right? Like, um, because a lot of times, 20 years ago, people were taking hybrids and vinifera, by the way, and making like somewhat sweet wine for the masses, right? And it's
Yeah.
don't blame the grape for poor winemaking is what I always say about like when people say they don't like Riesling. I'm like, well, your poor decision of buying an $8 bottle 20 years ago is not the grape's fault, like
Yeah.
realize
Yeah.
that every grape can be great if it's made well and grown well. Is my
Like
in the right.
Taylor's, yeah, like Taylor's, Manischewitz, they're all like up there using these mass produced things.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, that's like was the backbone of New York grape growing. Same with Michigan.
Right.
Same.
Yeah.
We have a very similar history that way. And I think as people are getting into hybrids and realizing you don't have to try to make an age-worthy Cab Franc or a age-worthy Chardonnay, you can make a wine that's meant to be consumed young and delicious and fun, right?
Right.
And also you had the Rieslings. Like this region, the number one planted grape is Riesling for a good reason. It loves it here. Like it needs less work than other vinifera. It loves the cold. You can always make it into a style that's fun, like that all that is gold that you had is, kind of that medium dry style. And I think that's like that was a reason.
Yeah, there was, I mean, tons of acidity, but you could definitely, I mean, the balance of the sweetness and acidity, it was, I mean, that is just like a crowd pleaser. Yeah. Like, I mean, that would appeal to pretty much anybody.
That ages well too. Some of the best Michigan wines I've had are medium dry Rieslings, 8 to 12 years of age, and they're like perfect wines, right? Like I used to bring them back and pour them for friends of mine that are winemakers in Napa, and they're like, "This is amazing, and you can do this for, $20, 20 something dollars in Michigan." I'm like, "Yeah, isn't that awesome?" Like,
nice.
So I can get my wines out of the glass because they're in price points that work for people. And I think with that is with the hybrid right now, and I know you're a big hybrid guy. It's no, and rightfully so. Like when I moved back, there was this like, Jets versus Sharks thing. Do you like hybrids? What do you think of them? I'm like, I don't know about them. So I've been able to like enjoy both and realize that I'm not going to join one camp or the other, but realize that if we're going to grow great grapes and well-farmed, organic, biodynamically farmed hybrids or vinifera, both are very doable in Michigan and they can make world-class wines. So why would I kick anybody out, right? Like,
yeah.
let's push into this and realize that, like, especially like Marquette, a lot of people want it to be like Cab Franc. And I'm like, no, it has tons of sugar, tons of acid, but the tannins aren't there. So lean into what it has, right? So the benefit of making wine in California is you lean into what California has, which is, ripeness and alcohol and tannins. And here, our red wines, like the Shipwreck you had, that's Blaufränkisch and Merlot bottled after 6 months because I want it to be fresh and I want to lean into that acid and that, that ripe fruit, that kind of blueberry quality. And so I think up here, like if you came up here, Adam, like you could come up here for a week and I wouldn't be able to cover all the cool things we're doing up here as
Yeah, sounds like
community
it.
wine, as you know, we have Sleeping Bear Dunes, which is a national lakeshore, like Big Sur, you know, like so it's so cool to see so many people doing amazing things up here. And as we move greener, I've just seen the quality go up.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm not like, I mean, I am pro hybrid, but it's because I'm like pro ecological thinking. Like, I don't want
Mhm.
people to have to spray 100 times in a season to be able to grow a grape that doesn't really do well there. You know what I mean? Even if you're doing it organically, or especially if you're doing it organically, it's like, I just like the idea of low input farming, in this ecological sense, so that you're not just continually needing to spray and that kind of thing. So I like
Well,
hardiness. I like internal, and I also, I mean, more and more, I really like variety and diversity. And I want every place in the world to develop its own culture rather than just replicate a European wine culture, here. And
amen.
yeah. So, but you can do that with a lot of different varieties of grapes, for sure. I just, yeah, like for me, it's always like what does well naturally without help from me, and in those climates, hybrids are the answer, or even natives are the answer, because
Yeah.
they're the hardiest.
Well,
But
and it's amazing too because we have tons of apples up here too. Like we've got so many great apple growers, and
yeah,
you see it more like the cider world like embraced it a long time ago, where it's like, hey, we're just gonna make really good cider, and we're gonna use the best apples we have, and we're gonna keep planting, you know, old heirloom varietals that went out of fashion during Prohibition, and it's they just have more of an ability uh, to shift their consumer that way, right? Where
yeah,
I make this great Chardonnay. You'd love it. It shows the place of Michigan. When somebody asked me once, they're like, "What would you compare it to?" I'm like, "Michigan." Like
yeah, that's awesome.
grown grapes in American Canyon Carneros. I love Oregon. I love Burgundy, but guess what? It's not any of those things. And I'm never going to comparison, right? Like you need to just create a new slot in your brain for Michigan Chardonnay. If you can't do that, I can't help you. Like,
Yeah.
and the same with like where you want to grow in New York. It's like, man, there's so many areas in this country. Like I've been to Virginia, I've been to Texas, where people doing really cool things. And I think that's what the consumer wants too. So we're I know everyone's freaking out about like people drinking less and this, that, and the other thing. I'm finding it to be not necessarily true for us because if people love what you're doing and love your story and you're not trying to sell them, kind of the white lies of the wine industry, you're going to do just fine. You'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, how are you able to grow? Like, what's your season like in terms of making it possible for vinifera to grow there? Do you have to bury vines or do anything like that in the winter, or and like what's the spray program look like?
Yeah.
How do you make that possible?
So we had early bud break this year. We were in like the second or third week of May. So put that in perspective to California, right? Like we
Yeah.
don't bud out till May, but we will still flower quite often around the 4th of July.
Yeah.
So our season from bud break to bloom is a dead on sprint.
Yeah.
Vines
That's
are just taking off, and like luckily like this year was great because we had extra time, and everyone goes, well, bud breaks early, so we're going to pick early. I'm like, bud break has nothing to do with when you pick. It has everything to do with bloom and your conditions during bloom. And so we had bloom this year, and we're probably on on average or maybe a week ahead, but like sparkling will get picked in September, Pinot Gris early varietals into September, and then October is the big push. So everything early reds like Pinot Noir, Gamay, kind of into September, beginning October, and if you're growing Cab Franc, Blanc Frankish, it's going to be the end of October, November, and um, good friend of mine, Brian Albrecht, who makes a lot of Blau, like 2 years in a row, because I have this 1 acre Blau vineyard. I out tasting fruit. I'm like, hey, what is Blau supposed to taste like when it's ripe? Because it doesn't taste ripe. He's like, I'm not sure we can get it ripe. And then we're working with Andrew and Ben down at Modalis, and they have Blau, and they're ripe like 3 weeks earlier because they've got way more sunshine than we do. I'm like, oh, I now know what it tastes like, and we have never gotten it fully ripe, and that's okay, right? It's still fine. And so you just have to kind of redefine how you look at ripening, right? Like we can get super cool physiological ripeness at low bricks, right? Where
Mm.
in Napa, that was always the dream. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're able to get that here. Um, I would say because of the water and our elongated season in the fall, and because of our soil types, we can grow vinifera and hybrids here depending on where you are. Like Michigan, Old Mission Peninsula, for instance, is 18 miles long by 5 miles wide. It's an AVA in Michigan. It's a great peninsula to grow on. I've grown enough fruit on there in the last 7 years to tell you there's probably 6 sub AVAs on that little piece. So
Mm.
rainfall, snow conditions, weather are very dependent on like a mile apart. They're not necessarily the same. It's really radical how much you can get. One place is raining and I'm a half mile away swimming and it's not raining at all, in the bay. And so,
Yeah.
so the variation up here is huge. So I always tell people like, not only dig soil pits because you need to know what your soils are down deep for picking the right rootstock, but throw up some thermometers. You need to know like if you're in a colder spot than you think,
Yeah.
So those are kind of the big. Spring frost is a big thing, which we haven't had. If the bays freeze, we can get negative degrees pretty easily up here, and it's happened twice, I think, in 20 years. So that's the like kind of bearing vines sort of thing. And 2014 or 15 was the last time you had a deep freeze, and yeah, some vines died. And when I got here in 17, people were digging them up, and I'm looking at it. Most of them died because they were J rooted, not because they were vinifera, right? Like
Oh, they
poor
just
planting. And
got
so
it.
for me, I look at that and go, wow, these vines all like everyone was like, oh yeah, I had 2-year-old Sauvignon Blanc that made it through that freeze, and it was pretty cold up here. And so I think because of our soil type, we can pick up degree days, and this is obviously not scientific, and don't quote me on it, but I see this as a farmer. Like most of my thoughts are from what I've experienced and not necessarily what I'm reading. I read a lot, but also I find that when you look at most of our academics, it's Newtonian science. So it's, black and white, wrote a hypothesis and under -5, your vines will die, um, and
Yeah.
I'm much more on the Steiner side, the Goethean science, where it's like, hey, it's all a relationship and go be a part of that relationship and understand it for yourself, because then
Yeah.
you can make better decisions for the plant, the soil, and the surrounding areas. Our spray program that I've put together, and uh, my email is david@boswine.com. I'm really bad at email, but if anyone wants to email me and has questions about it, I'm open book about everything, Adam. If anyone has any questions, like I don't look at what my information is. I'll gladly share anything I'm doing with anyone because I want to change farming, right?
Yeah. And
Uh,
that's BOS, not
yeah,
BOSS.
it's David at boswine.com. So our spray program starts off, I really like stylet oil. I think that's really good at the beginning of the season. We
Yeah.
have the things that really hurt us are powdery mildew. We get a little black rot, downy, phomopsis, which I'm less worried about. And then obviously we have our IPM system set up here, which we get potato leafhoppers, rose chafers, Japanese beetles are kind of the 3 main things.
And you probably get a little anthracnose, and you said sour rot too, right?
Yes. Yep, you get a little bit of that.
Yeah.
I haven't had to deal with as much sour rot like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's great.
The biggest thing is, and this is like where people are like, oh, you got to spray so much more because you're organic. It's like, well, you heard how I said we have bud break and then we have flowering sometimes a month later.
Yeah.
We can get like 30 centimeters of growth in a week. So think about that. Like our growth, it's a dead sprint. So
Yeah.
I don't care if you're organic or conventional. If you're not spraying weekly, half your vine is unprotected, right?
Right. Right.
And like we're cooler too. So like the idea of using sulfur for everything, like in California, it just doesn't work. So luckily, there's tons of great organic options. And I've been working with Andrew and Ben down at Modalis, and I know you're talking with Andrew later this week. He'd be the one to talk to. He and Ben have done so much awesome research. I now kind of lean on them because they know every organic possible biological that you could use, and it's really cool to see what they've done. But for me, it's about, in Michigan, the biggest thing you can do against downy and powdery mildew, and even black rot, is open up your canopy. The cultural practices that we need to adhere to are specific on timing, right? Like
Yeah.
I said, it's a sprint. So if you're not tucking and suckering, you're going to have just more growth. if you're not pulling leaves on Chardonnay and Cab Franc right after bloom, you're creating space for mildew to thrive, right? And so I would say half of my quote unquote disease prevention is good cultural practices in the vineyard.
Canopy management.
Those,
Yeah.
your pressures go way down.
Yeah. So
Um,
is anybody doing a high trellis system there? Because I'm just like more and more like I can't see why we do VSP other than unless you, I mean, in 1 to 5 acre vineyards, like anything that's not meant to be some huge production commercial vineyard, like I, to me, a raised trellis system just makes so much sense. But maybe, I don't know, does that work? I know like hybrids historically have been on a high wire cordon, but
so
what about,
historically in Michigan, VSP cane pruning, 7x4, 8x4, 9x4 is kind of what we see right now, and
right,
hybrids are single wire high. Um, this is
right.
the youth of an industry, right? Like
Yeah.
I would say, in farming, like you don't be first, don't be last, sort of concept, right? As organics is taking off, like, and people have already started doing it now. Other people are like, well, I don't want to be last to this game, which I'm so happy we got there as quickly as we did. And it's not everyone, obviously, but a lot of people. So I've played around with head training with for Gamay, with Mari, and looking at different spacing. And yeah, higher wire makes sense in some locations. We get a lot of wind though, and so
Yeah.
and
Yeah. You're out on the lake. Yeah.
cooler site, I would actually prefer my vines being closer to the ground so that sandy soil can be kind of like a warm spot for it.
Yeah, except when you get a early or late frost and then being close to the ground, if you're above that 30-inch line, you can get up above the frost. That's what I'm finding is like we're, in the vineyard that I'm working in, we're at head height where the
Mhm.
growth area is. And on our newer vines, anything below 30 inches gets toasted by the frost. We had a couple late frosts this season after bud break and shoot growth, and everything above that was beautiful. Like, and it was just like a line you could see where the frost stopped. And once you're above that line, everything was safe. So, establishing is one thing, but once you're up above that, like if you're pushing shoots at 55 inches or anything above 40, you're like, it just gives you a lot of protection. So that's why I thought, especially for colder climates where you have a lot more
So
potential for that.
so yeah, like you're thinking, yeah, we're in a cool spot, right? Yeah, you're a little cooler than other places in California. We're downright cold, right? Like
Yeah.
cool climate,
Right.
climate growing. If we get a frost, everything's getting smoked, right? Like
Everything.
we don't
Okay.
have
It
inversion.
doesn't save you. Okay.
I mean, if you're too close to the water, it might make sense to go higher. But like
Yeah.
when I've seen frost roll in, it's like, yeah, no one can be saved. So,
Okay. Okay.
so
That's what I'm asking. Yeah. Okay. Good
so
to hear.
I have no doubt we get some of those like lighter frosts, and you have these frost pockets in vineyards, especially when like airflow is so important. You walk
Right.
in the
Yeah.
vineyard,
If you're on a hill or so you have good drainage, maybe
yeah, but
kind of
also
thing.
I was in one vineyard and they're like, "Oh, we always get frost down here." I'm like, "You've got all these trees. Create an airflow. Like these trees are damming up the cold air. It's not that you're up high enough on a hill." And they're like, "Oh, we never thought of that." So they created this like, where the low air would hit, they cleared out some of the underbrush of the trees, and they don't have frost anymore. So in
Yeah.
Michigan, you have to be really good about checking temperatures. And there was another person that was pretty low, and it was amazing that just up the hill, like we have hills, we don't have mountains in Michigan, right?
Yeah.
So probably elevation change of like 40 feet, but it was over a couple hundred yards. Up top of the hill didn't freeze, and down low it did. So my recommendation was, if you're going to plant grapes there, make sure they're very late budding varietals. But in reality, you have 40 acres, so why don't you start up top and see if you even need to plant down here?
Right. Right.
And so that's some of it too. So
Yeah.
the reason I want to play around with high trellising, to be honest, is because of what you're doing with the sheep, right? Like I want.
Yeah. Well, that's the other benefit. Yeah. One of the other benefits. Yeah, definitely.
We have actual winter here, so once our vines start growing, like we have bud break and cover crops and grasses are growing at the same time. So I
Right.
keep in before bud break because there's nothing for them to eat.
Right. Yeah. It's even more important there. Yeah. Because the only time that you can get grazing done is during,
Yeah.
during the vine growing season.
At American Canyon, we got like a handful of sheep and it's 160 acres at Gurgitch. Like they could roam anywhere they wanted for like 3 months and not do not have any bud break, right? And they could eat
Right. Right.
heart's desire. We're here, our growing season is everything takes off with a bang in the spring.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, the high I do think the high trellis for certain hybrids totally makes sense, and probably some vinifera as well. I do think working on getting the trellis more open. I saw
Yeah.
some Baca Noir yesterday um, uh, with a friend of mine that like it's like a split canopy up high, and they just open the canopy on top because like we don't have sunburn here, so you can literally like clear out the whole middle. The grapes are sitting in the sun, and it's great, right, for ripening, for mildew, for all those things. And so like that was a spot where he's hoping to get some sheep in there because guess what? Like even if they eat the ends of the tips that are almost to the ground, it doesn't matter because they have so much leaf material up higher.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the benefit. Actually, they do the sort of hedging for you and shoot like suckering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think some of that is definitely coming. I also think there's a lot of spots in Michigan where head training like Gamay, head training varietals that like want to be head trained makes sense, or especially if you're on a steeper hillside. We've traditionally, Michigan has not needed to irrigate. So 20 years ago, you put a vineyard in, you didn't even have to irrigate. In the last 5 years, we've had drought-like conditions. So to give you an example, I think you had that 21 Riesling, that 21 vintage. So
I'm literally pouring it in my glass right now.
Hey guys, we're not on video. I just like that's the biodynamic mind working right there.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, guys, we have to have a little fun with biodynamics because it is crazy. So
once you're in tune, you know, everything clicks.
So vintage, so time and place, right? Place being Old Mission Peninsula, that's sandy loam limestone we're talking about, and the time being the 21 vintage. We had a warm spring, summer, and fall. And in the fall in October, we had like 8 days of 75 plus degree weather. So we were able to get Riesling even riper. That All That Is Gold we have is a 22 vintage, which is more classic, warm summer, cooler fall, and great for grape growing. 21 was downright warm during harvest. And we were able to get that physiologically ripe. That is dry, right? There's probably 3 grams, 3 grams per liter, so it's bone dry.
Yeah.
But the acid drops, and that acid is still high.
This Riesling that I'm drinking is only 3 grams RS?
3 to 5, somewhere in that range. It's really
okay.
Low. But
I mean, it's got a ton of sweet fruitiness. Yeah.
Yeah, because we were able to get it.
Not like sweet. It's not sweet. I wouldn't call it sweet at all. Like you said, I was just thinking sort of like off dry or, and the acid sort of subsumes that sweetness, within balance, you know what I mean? So just, anyway, it's a beautiful balanced Riesling.
Because we were able to get it so ripe, right? So that like I always look at Riesling being a triangle. You got residual sugar, acid, and then physiological ripeness, right? That wine is low in sugar, low in acid, but high in physiological ripeness, right? You're getting all that peach skin, you're getting honeysuckle, all those things that you would assume on a sweeter wine, where that All That Is Gold is considered medium dry on the IRF code because it has so much acid to balance out the little bit of sugar.
What would you call it? If this was like a German, where would you classify this? I mean, it's even, it's got the classic sort of petrol nose, and
it would be, I'm sure you'll get emails about my German. It would be like a dry Auslese, it's okay. It could be Trocken.
Yeah,
it could actually be Trocken. It's because
TBA.
Of the but in that vintage, like and this is the thing where like you always like if you're not actually there, like if somebody 5 years from now studies the 21 vintage, they're going to read that it was top 5 warmest spring, summer, and fall, and it was the wettest year on record. It's not to tell them anywhere it was a drought-like year because we got 3 big shots. July, we had a storm come through and drop 8 or 9 inches and knock out power. 3 weeks later, it had been 80 degrees for 3 weeks, and the vines were stressed out from heat because we had sandy loam limestone soils, right? Like it drains,
right?
It
really just drains,
well. And so historically, Michigan would always get rain every 10 days. Like this year, we've had rain every 10 days, and that was the thing I was joking with somebody at the conference. It's like I don't care if you're organic or conventional. Like if you're not paying attention to the weather this year, you're probably going to have more issues, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to like realize that I don't care what you spray. If you get an inch of rain the next day, you probably don't have great coverage anymore. And so in 21, it was a warm spring, summer, fall, and it was a hot year and a drought year. And that spring, we had done some planting, and I had to water every 7 days because it was warm and we weren't getting rain. But when you get these huge rain events, because that's what we're seeing, I think everyone thinks like Michigan's going to, with climate change, Michigan's going to be growing Cabernet Sauvignon in 5 years. It's like, no, we're getting more extremes too. So you have to
Yeah.
be ready to deal with them. And that's where, luckily for us, I mean, we have 20% of the world's fresh water in the Great Lakes. We have water for days. So if we want to irrigate, it's really not that big of a deal. Like,
Right.
it's not California where like water is a much more coveted resource, right? Like here
Right.
we have it in spades. And so that's kind of the Michigan side that I want people to know and hear, is that you can't just read about it and like understand that like, oh, it's really wet and warm that year. It's like, well, it was wet for like 8 days out of 90, but
Right.
the other
Right.
8 days it was pretty warm. And even like 3 or 4 years ago, I was at P45, which is a great grower organization up here, did this conference on under the vine maintenance, and so like talking about getting a bunch of growers together, giving them a bunch of free information on how to get away from spraying. So obviously, I'm there. I'm like, this is a great thing, and started talking to some farmers. I'm like, hey, are you guys starting to see heat stress, water stress? And they're like, oh, we don't have that here in Michigan. I'm like, well, we do now because I'm seeing it. And they're like, well, how do you know it looks like? I lived in Napa for 13 years. Like I can't unsee what heat stress looks like on a vineyard,
Yeah.
So that's a whole new thing that we are looking at. How do we go about that in, a very sensitive, but also practical way of making sure we have the conditions we need, right? Because
Yeah.
everything's changing up here too.
Can you describe that appearance of the vine? Like what you
Yeah.
look for in terms of, happiness versus stress with
Right.
relation to water and heat?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we were in a vineyard, it'd be easier because I could probably
Yeah, I know. Visuals would be so much better.
the biggest thing is, and in the springtime, in a younger vineyard or a vineyard that is growing actively, you'll start to see tendrils drying back. And
Yeah.
once they are shorter than the apical meristem, the tip of the vine, you're having some water stress, most likely, because if you're pre-bloom, all it wants to do is grow, and you don't have something you need, and that is water.
So in other words, the tendrils should be reaching out, like they're like
Mhm.
arms pulling, like they're going to grab and pull the vine up. So if they're
Yes.
reaching out in front of the tip, then they're like, that's a good sign. Like it's
Yep.
happy. It's climbing. It wants, it's continuing to do what it wants to do. But if they're like drooped back, then it's like having your arms at your side versus you can't really climb that way.
Exactly. And I mean, this is just talking water stress. There's obviously
Right.
macronutrients that can do some of these things too. So just
Right.
looking at water stress. The other thing is look at the leaves. The leaves should be, a young leaf should be like green and somewhat flat and feel not like paper. When they start to cup and they start to look dry and you feel them and they're dry, the leaf doesn't have enough. The roots aren't being able to pull up enough water to move things through the xylem and phloem. So it's saying, hey, I'm stressed, so my leaf doesn't have what it needs to do what it's supposed to be doing. So it's a physical touch. It's a visual recognition is the way I do water stress, because and you can do pressure bounce. Like there's a lot of like technology out there, but like just
Right.
train yourself to know what things look like, and you're going to be a whole lot better than like, and I send out petioles. I do all that stuff, right? Those things are all good. Science is a great tool for vineyards, but do never let it be a crutch. And I think that's one of the things in organic and biodynamic farming, especially, is
learn to be a good listener and observer.
Yeah. Be a part of the vineyard, right? Like,
Yeah.
So that's kind of the water stress. And so some vineyards are putting in irrigation that have never had it before. I saw a drop in crop load because of that. Like the next year, like if a vine is stressed in the buds the year before, it's setting the crop load for the following vintage, right? It's telling the vine is like regulating itself.
Do you ever see it drop older leaves? Like, so you're getting loss of leaves closer to the fruit zone?
Lots in Michigan. I saw it in California in a couple dry farm vineyards where you just see. The other thing is too, is if you have viruses in your vineyard, which are not that uncommon around the world, right? Like vines aren't perfect. And so one of the vineyards at Gergish, like the Yountville Old Vine Cab has viruses. And if they're happy, they don't, if they're not stressed, they don't show signs of the virus as quickly.
Yeah.
And the same thing with like water stress. If you have water, if you have enough water to the vine, and we're not talking a ton of water here either, it just needs to have enough. And so if you have water, you're not going to see those signs of stress as quickly. But once, like some of the old vine dry farm stuff in California, when you go look at it in a hot year, it's like, oh, it's dropping leaves, it's showing virus, and it's really struggling to get to the finish line. And, you could say, hey, that's where all the quality comes from. But I also look at it and go, well, that could be a quality thing, or it could be I'm stressed out and I need a drink.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Well, I want to ask you, I know you're a big compost and even biochar person.
Yep.
I want to talk about that. I just want to give you anecdotally, my vines in my backyard, I haven't watered them at all this year.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't rained here since April, I think. It was probably the last rain, early April. I still have green growing ground cover, and the vines are putting out second crops of grapes. I just had to hedge for like the seventh or eighth time. And I'm like, yes, I've been working on the soil for 12 years, improving the soil of my yard and, just treating it like a garden, the whole thing like a garden. I'm a huge, however, believer that the thing that's making the biggest difference is biochar or charcoal. In my case, I don't know. I've done big burns here basically. So I have reached pretty high temperatures. So I have a mix of everything, but I'm not doing like kiln, real controlled where I know I'm producing biochar, but I've burning in general. Um, Lots of that in the soil. I mean, I just cannot tell you. It's too fertile for grapes. Like my vines are out of control. Like they're monstrous, and the crops are insane, and like to the point that it's just crazy. Like, and we saw something in the vineyard this year. This winter, we burnt piles of cuttings next in this little spot next to the vineyard. This is up in very brittle, dry area in the Central Coast. But it was, of course, this wasn't dry at that time. It was, green and wet and everything. We burned on rainy days, and it was just probably like a 25 by 50 little oval area where we burnt all these piles of cuttings from pruning. And as the season went along, and in May, basically everything just turns brown and dries up. And 3 weeks after the entire landscape had turned completely brown, that oval stayed green. Like same exact species of plants. Like we double checked everything. Like it was incredible. It was just like this amazing visual, like undeniable sign of the like what was happening because of just burning on that site. So something pretty incredible. So that's my anecdotal thing, but I know there's a ton of amazing studies about it, and I know you work with it a lot. So I'd love to hear, what you're what you're doing with compost and biochar.
So I think when you said you hedged 7 or 8 times, that like was put up a little flag for me, because that's telling me you're too fertile.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. It's not, I should be growing like tomatoes and like I should be doing like I should be growing corn here or something. It's insane.
And up here too, there's a couple vineyards that I've had to like people look at when we're in full harvest that are still neon green.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I want my vineyard to look like that. I'm like, not if you want good grapes. Like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
should be
Oh, yeah.
down. The vines during harvest should be not focusing on leaves, but 100% focusing on ripening fruit. Right.
Yeah.
So that being said, like, I think the idea of like people wanting things to be green and beautiful, like up here is still a thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I want the cover crop. I want the grasses to look good and be mowed. I'm like, that's fine, but like, you don't need to. It's not a golf course.
Right.
So for me with compost, and this is where we do these dig nights at the wine garden in the winter, where I'll have like other winemakers or friends come in, and we'll talk about anything from cheese to chocolate to coffee to wine, all kind of on that organic biodynamic spectrum, right, of cool things going on up in northern Michigan. And I've got a couple friends that will show up and just wait like 20 minutes, then ask me about either digging soil pits or compost to see if they're off track for like 20 minutes. So I know there's several people listening right now that like just started a stopwatch when you asked about compost. So let's see if we can't make them proud. So for me, good composting is the backbone of good farming. If you want to change farming on a large or small scale, compost is going to be the thing that gets you there. Yes, animals on your farm would be better, but we have to make faster steps, and composting is probably the answer for most small vineyards, backyard farms, backyard gardens. In 1 pound of compost, you can have a billion living things, organisms, and that's going to help change your soil. So often we look at NPK and micronutrients, and then there's that little organic matter where people say you should be between 1.5% and 2% for vineyards. And I go, 1.5%, 2% of what? Organic matter? Like the idea that all organic matter is equal is just rubbish in my opinion, right? Like
Yeah.
I want high quality organic matter, and you're going to get that with composting. And if you're listening right now, composting is not fertilizer. So you got to shift how you look at fertilizing and getting nutrients to the vine and say, hey, I am going to add compost to my vineyard in order to make my farm better, right? We're applying it to make soil healthier. When you get your soil healthier, that all the microbiology and that's in your soil, like everything underneath the soil works so much better when you have healthy, fungus and all the mycorrhizae, all those things work together, right? Like it's amazing when you think about what compost adds to the soil. So compost and cover cropping are the two best ways we can enrich our nutrient content of our soil. And I always tell people, like, yeah, you don't have to compost every year as long as you don't take fruit. If you're taking fruit from a grapevine, you're taking the best parts of the grapevine. So you need to be offsetting that with something. And so for me, composting, cover cropping, over time, I've just seen over time how much it strengthens the vine, how much it strengthens your farm system. And so, yeah, I used to make biodynamic compost in California and sell organic compost, because if you look right now, and this is where, Napa is a little different that way, but everyone composts. Doesn't matter if you're organic, conventional, or biodynamic, because it's such a small thing on a line item to improve your soil health that everyone should be doing it, because it is the question I ask people, like, hey, like when people tell me, like I'm at a farm conference, they're like, oh, we're really sustainable. I'm like, well, do you still spray Roundup? Yeah. Well, you're not doing anything. If they say no, and then my next question always is, do you use compost? Because if I can only have a 5-minute conversation with somebody, I want to get to compost right away and tell them, like, hey, if you're moving more sustainable, if you're trying to improve your farm, whether it's grapes or anything else, like, use compost. Compost is going to get you there, because you're looking at the whole system of taking, and when I say compost, you don't have to use animal manure, but cow dairy manure is the best. Use what you have.
I found chickens is incredible as well.
Like, chicken's going to be hot though. Like, you're going to get nitrogen in that soil and a hustle, right? And so, like, any kind of compost, like, know your compost, like, have a test run on it so you kind of know what it is. A good composter will be testing their compost very regularly. I know all the ones that I use do, and apply it. And so in Michigan, the beautiful thing about Michigan is we're not as hot as California. So even if you're not cultivating, you can spread compost and the grasses will grow around it and it doesn't dry out. Where, like, in California, you got to be really sensitive about when you apply compost, because you don't want that to dry out on the topsoil. You want it to either leach in or work into your soil one way or another. And so when I look at adding compost, and when I, like, one of my small farmers, 10 Hands, they make their own compost. And he's always disappointed he doesn't make enough. I'm like, you are making compost on site in 2 acres. This is seriously crazy impressive, right? And so like, you can make your own, but realize that you probably don't have enough room to do it all on your own. And that kind of goes to one of the 4 legs I look at in biodynamic farming, right? Is that composting and cover crop is so key to farming. Like, before we even get into cow horns or get into the preparations, right? Like, if you're not composting and cover cropping, you're not actually putting, you're not feeding your soil correctly, If you're not out there observing the vines, like we're just talking about this whole thing, if you're not being diverse by planting other things, right? Like, these are all concepts that aren't uniquely biodynamic, but they're very biodynamic in a way, right? So I always get it when people are like, we're doing all these other things. I'm like, well, really good organic farming is pretty close to biodynamic. Really poor organic farming is very far from biodynamic. So the organic farming is a big spectrum. Biodynamics is pretty specific. And the reason I like it is it gives people tools that even if you don't know how they work, I've watched them work, right? And so that's all of biodynamic farming. And there's a great book about the moon cycles, and we don't have to get into it, but Maria Toon. Maria Toon wrote a book called Gardening for Life. Um,
Okay.
and it's a 40-year study on radishes around the moon cycles. Like, just think of like an old German woman who did biodynamics. You know that they can't get away from not tracking everything, you know. And so biodynamics
Right.
is a lot easier to understand in a garden setting where you have 30-day crops like radishes and spinach, or arugula. You know, like these things all like are much easier to see how biodynamic farming works because you're tasting them, and there's nobody that's writing a magazine about, like, there's no like arugula spectator, so you don't have outside influences. So if you do any gardening, I would recommend start there with biodynamics, and then you can start applying it to grapevines, which are very subjective, and you pick them once a year, and everyone has an opinion, right? Like, you get you can get three vineyard, managers together and have four opinions on how to prune. Like, it's just a thing. Where
Right.
in a backyard garden, you're going to see results. And that's how I had to do a lot of it. Is I started doing biodynamics, I got it, but then once I started applying it in my garden, I saw it and could taste it, and I'm like, yes, this is the answer. Like, in that garden in American Canyon we were talking about, I grew fennel from seed and just used the biodynamic practices. And I had two chefs come down, like, from Napa, that love, like, they're looking at so many things from all over the world, right? And the fennel, like, they were describing it, like the shape and how it looked, and it was 100% like they were describing biodynamics, and I had never grew fennel before, and
Hmm.
so that's the cool thing about biodynamic farming, is you can start doing it today. And I always tell people, you don't need to go buy a cow, you don't need to do all these things. We live in a world where you can actually buy some of the biodynamic preps and you can do some of the things, right?
Yeah.
So start where you are. That's key. Like, if you want to get into it, don't wait, just jump into it. Barrel compost, which Maria Toon, also this same lady, came up with this concept of how you can make a biodynamic prep in your backyard in a barrel with manure and all the preps, right? Because she's working with a lot of gardeners that didn't have the ability to compost, and they didn't have they didn't have the money to compost, right? And
Yeah.
so she's like, hey, I've got the thing that's going to help you, do both biodynamics and composting at the same time. So all the biodynamic preps do is add kind of icing to the cake of composting, cover cropping, observing biodiversity. But you can't be biodynamic without them. So when you think of what Goethe and Steiner and these people were thinking about, they were talking to people over 100 years ago, and they were already, before the Industrial Revolution, seeing the lack of nutrients in the farm systems. So there was already 20 years before, like, all the really, like, crazy, chemicals came out in the 40s and 50s to, kill, destroy, or strengthen, came out. They
Yeah.
were already seeing it. And some of that is because we don't have, like if you have a backyard vineyard or a 2-acre vineyard, you don't have all the space you'd need to be completely self-sufficient. Now, you can get pretty close, but you're probably always going to have inputs from outside. So the goal is how do you get less and less of those happening, right? And
Yeah.
biodynamics is going to get you there a lot faster, because these preparations, they work with the microbial life, right? Like, I think it's I was in Napa building a compost pile for a client, and we were doing it on his friend's property. He had a lot more property, so we were able, like, he had some space that it wasn't a big deal. And a couple of people are just like, you guys are putting these preps in this pile, and you guys are just kind of crazy. And I've been doing it 20 years, Adam. I get it all the time, and I just, like,
Yeah.
now it just kind of makes me smile, because I'm like, well, either you want to shift how you look at farming or you don't. But if you pay attention, you're going to see some changes. The next morning, one of the guys that didn't believe it called me. He's like, what else did you guys do to the pile after I left? Because it's so much hotter than it was yesterday morning. Like, what did you do? I'm like, you saw what we did. He's like, no, what else did you do? I'm like, nothing. Like, when you work with nature, if you work with nature to heal nature, guess what? Nature's really good at it, right? Like, I think that's where, whether you're looking at the human body, soil, when you're working with natural things and natural concepts that are already existing in nature and then personifying them, you're going to get that effect. And I think that's the thing where with biodynamics, and a lot of times I think people look at biodynamic farming and go, oh, it's so rigid. It's like, no, this was just the setup for what you can do. You can use tons of other plants to heal plants, right? Like,
Yeah.
worked in Napa with, like, using calendula, which is not in any biodynamic anywhere, but you look at the plant, it's great at, like, mildew prevention. So why would I want to make a tea out of that and see if it helps, Because if you do something like that, you're wrong. You're wrong, like, just a little bit. If you spray the wrong chemical and you're wrong a lot of it, you know?
Yeah.
So with biodynamic farming, I always look at it as like a lot of small movements the right direction.
Yeah. There's like 9 preps, right?
Yes. Yep.
And
And
I mean, other than the manure compost, they're plant based and or quartz, I guess, is one of them. But okay, so like what 8 of them or 7 of them are plant based, and are they all different species of plants?
yes,
Am
all
I-
the plants that you can find that Steiner talks about are found on every continent in differing degrees, right?
Yeah,
Like
and
it's
so it's encouraging diversity just in terms of like if like getting these things involved in your farming includes having a nice array of different kinds of plants besides just what you think of as your cash crop. It's like suddenly you start thinking about diversity in plant life, which I think is a huge benefit as well, just to everything. Like when you have multiple things growing together. There was a story I was going to tell you about when we were talking about when we were talking about frost and all the different things that go into frost, and all frost isn't the same. We just had a little workshop with Christine Jones. It was like her last public speaking engagement. And if anybody doesn't know her, if you don't know her, she's like amazing and definitely worth looking up and finding any materials online, talks and things like that, podcasts, anything you could find by her. She's incredible. But she had pictures showing a guy who was just doing trials like sort of haphazardly and discovered something unintentionally where side by side fields he planted like a monocrop in one field. It was just like rye grain or something like that, and then in the without any kind of division, like no fence row or anything like that, he just switched because he had all these other, he like kind of ran out, but he had a mix of like 4 different plants in the other field. You could see first of all that when they started growing, the monocrop was shorter, slower, stunted. The other crop, direct, I mean, like no division. You could just see where he's changed the seeds when he ran out or whatever,
yeah,
and it was like taller, thicker, lusher, just from having a diversity. No other treatments to the soil at all. And then a frost hit. The entire monocrop was frosted, 0 frost on the polycrop, and it was because higher bricks, healthier plants, all the like every other condition was accounted for. Is just like having a diversity of plants together is this massive benefit to each of the plants involved in that system. And I that was going to lead me into asking you about what your thoughts are on cover crops and things like that, what you're doing in terms of green compost or things like that.
so when you were talking, it brought up this thought for me that I think about a lot is in biodynamic farming, you're looking at the health, quality, and vitality of the whole overall farm system. Because I love walking vineyards, I love looking at
Right.
vines, but when I'm thinking about my vineyards, I'm thinking about the soil health almost exclusively most of the time.
Yeah.
And when you change the biodynamics has an amazing way of having a paradigm shift on how you look at all of farming, right? And in that, like cover crops, for instance, and I know, recently cultivation is like one of the the biggest tools in farming that people are against. And for me, it's like anytime we adjust, as good Americans, we're going to over adjust as hard as we can,
Right. Right. Right.
because I've been to some
Yeah.
periods where I'm like, yeah, I get it. You want to sequester carbon right now. The plants growing are doing nothing for that. So you might see some results in like 200 years. So let's go
Right. Right.
ahead, add a boatload of compost, work in some soil, and plant things that are going to do the thing we want to do.
Yeah.
Because if you
Yeah.
plant a vineyard in a field that used to be cherries or apples up here, and it was like treated poorly for 30 years, you have to do some work on the front end of getting your soil back in a right.
Right.
And so like, and by the way, like my goal is always to try to get to a place where you don't have to cultivate, right? Like but
Yeah.
you have to understand how to get there, right? You can't
Yeah.
just stop doing everything in farming and be like, look how beautiful it is. And you're like, half the things growing there are invasive and or really bad for your vine or soil. So let's go ahead and do a little work here.
Yeah.
But so if you're not if you know you're going to turn the cover crop in, and so in Michigan, you also have to realize that we get rain. So one vineyard that was weak and had really poor things growing, I said, okay, fine, we're gonna I composted it, did that barrel compost by Maria Toon. I also did a Pfeiffer field spray that we could talk about, which I think is a great tool set for people that like don't want to get on the woo-woo biodynamic side, but like Pfeiffer field spray and Pfeiffer compost starter are two amazing things you can buy from Josephine Porter Institute, jpi.org out of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And they work like yeast, so you rehydrate them. So I find that every winemaker can kind of get behind that because you're taking a composted material, reheating it with warm water for 24 hours, then spraying it over your whole field, right?
Yeah.
And Evo and I saw great results doing this on wheat blocks, but this block I'm talking about of Riesling, by composting, doing the barrel compost, and planting cover crop seeds, the vines just got invigorated in 1 year. I had people going out there going, how'd you do that? Like, it's magic. I'm like, well, we're changing the soil and it's going to take a few years, but we're going to start with good compost. We're going to open up the soil and it's sandy soil. So the cover crops, I planted them in June. By like July, you wouldn't even know that I worked up the soil, right?
Yeah.
But we had this stand of like bell beans and radishes and all these cool, like diverse things. Like we had 12 different things growing in there, all building up the soil, right? So then I go to mow it and you got radishes dying back and you have like so many more places in that first foot of soil for things to live, right? And so I think that's the key is once you get into a healthy system, I always want diverse cover crops. Like I rarely would I say, yeah, you know what, you should grow all wheat in between your vines or all bell beans. I think I go a little heavier on legumes here in Michigan because of our sandy soils. We have a lot of nitrogen fixers, and sometimes our cation exchange can be off too. So if you can get that organic material up, you're going to have more availability and get that calcium relationship in place, but also having living nitrogen. And this is what I talk about is like we have plants that will actually push nitrogen into the soil. You shouldn't have to put any nitrogen on a grapevine if you're growing cover crops because that living nitrogen, it works 10 times better than 20 or whatever you've put out in the past because it sticks around in the soil. Other things want to hold on to it and hand it off to the vine, right? And so for me, it's always about diversity, but look at what your soil type is, right? Like if you have heavy clay soils, plant taprooted things so they can break up that soil, right? Like I don't need to do that here because the sandy loam soils, like it's already like pretty, you can dump a bunch of water on it and it's not going to stick around. So you plant things that will help hold water capacity, but also hold nutrients at a place where it will get to the vines.
Yeah. They're starting to, create organic matter in that sandy soil. Yeah. I mean,
talk about composting. It's one and the same with cover crops, right? Like, I always say compost cover crops. People are like, well, they're different. I'm like, they should be like Bert and Ernie, right? Like,
because you're essentially inoculating the microbiology with both.
Absolutely.
Like you have to think about like many soils, as we're now finding, like have 1,000-year levels. I mean, like the 1,000-year levels of the nutrients that we think they're low in. It's that they're not accessible. It's like we haven't made them accessible because we're not growing things, we're not fertilizing, we're not adding because the microbiology isn't there. And so you're really just like feeding microbiology, which then gives everything that grows there availability to the things that are already there. And making, so again, it's like when you're adding nutrients, a lot of them just kind of wash away anyway. Like you're kind of wasting a lot of inputs by doing that rather than just like unlocking what's already present in your soils.
And every micro and macronutrient in a grapevine has a deficiency you can see with your eyes. So if you don't know what they are, you can Google them. Like you can be in the like this red vine, is it potassium or is it red blotch or is it leaf roll 1 or 2? You know what I mean? Like you can like look up in the field. I have a book to use because I'm old. So don't feel like you need to know it all. Also, if you're planting a vineyard, you need to find a really forward-thinking, awesome agronomist. We've got several in Michigan that like, I'll tell you right now, I send them pictures. I'm like, I don't know what this is, And like one thing on one of our vineyards right now, I still don't know. They don't know. And it's probably not a big deal, but like, I just haven't seen it before. Right. Also that agronomist, like we sent out lab reports and up here, like 7 years ago, everyone wanted to keep dumping potash and add potassium because their soil reports or, their soil or petioles were coming back low in potassium. I'm like, I don't see potassium deficiency. So I'm going to push against this. And I ended up sitting in a room, called up the chemical company or the lab and talked to them. He's like, yeah, you're low in potassium if you're trying to grow 10 to 12 tons of Concord, but if you're under 4 tons per acre of wine grapes, you're fine. I'm like, well, why is it set up and saying it's low? He's like, well, more Concord people send us in samples than wine grapes. I'm like,
Right.
oh, got it. But I had to get him on the phone with everyone that was trying to make this decision. I said, you guys don't believe me, but we're going to talk to him. And then if you still want to add potassium, you can. But if both he and I agree, like you're paying me to give you my advice, and this is my advice. If you want to add potassium in a living form, the plant yarrow, which is one of the biodynamic plants, you can make that into a tea and spray it on your vines, and you're going to get living potassium. The potassium prep that goes into our prep pile is living forms of teaching your compost pile what potassium does. So find it in a living form first, because they're all around us. If you drink yarrow tea, you'll lower your blood pressure. Blood pressure is connected to pH, which is potassium based. Like it's all right there. And I have no doubt I've said something wrong in this podcast app. And that's why I gave my email, so they can email me instead of you about it. But that's the beauty of biodynamic farming. I'm 20 years in, and I feel like I'm just at the edge of what I know, right? Like when you work with nature, you will be shocked and awed more often than not about how cool this process is. And if you're doing conventional farming, man, it's a grind. And I watch people get so sad when they lose a crop to mildew that could have been prevented, or they're picking out, half their crop is sour rot, or they send it to the winery and the winery is picking out the sour rot, or they're making a lesser wine. Because it's like farming is an extreme amount of effort and work for a very meager return. So we can't look at it like, like on a 1-year spreadsheet. You should have a 5-year plan and a 50-year plan for your farm.
Yeah.
And you should be doing something every year for that 50-year plan. That's why those gardens at Gergich look so beautiful.
I'm glad you said that. I mean, here's a concept I've been wrestling with lately that is kind of blowing my own mind, which is, I talk about mimicking nature. I mean, this is, and working with nature and trying to, align with these things that are happening that I'm part of, and, that I should be a better participant in rather than a fighter against. And what kind of the realization I'm coming to is like, nature doesn't have a stagnant system. Like we think of agriculture as like, we want to grow a vineyard for the next 50 years. And it's like, well, nature thinks in succession. Like there is no place in nature that's going to stay the same for 50 years. Like if you mimic nature, you need to build succession somehow into your farming system, which is just antithetical. Like we want to grow corn for the next, whatever. We've been growing, like some fields have been growing corn in the Midwest for years, for decades. And it's like, it's like, that's just a dead end system. Like that's not how it works. And how to do that is, I guess, what I've been wrestling with, and it's kind of been blowing my mind, is like, what does that look like when you start thinking about 50 years, 100 years, and that you have to embrace and embody change in the system that you design, which means you're going to, all these things that you invest in have to be nimble, because if you're super deeply invested in something, of course you want it to remain so that you can get a return on that investment. But how do you find that balance between, adaptation versus like return on investment, I guess. Anyway, that's a thought that's been blowing my mind lately.
So my takeaway from that, so anytime I do these talks, I make notes, because I feel like if I write it down, then my brain has a better chance of remembering it. I just wrote down, what is your succession plan for your farm/soil? Like,
yeah.
Look at it that way. Be like, hey, I know you have a succession plan for other things. What does your soil succession plan look like? And there's so many people pushing into like, my friend Christy Apple, if you ever wanted to talk to an agronomist that's working with the Haney method of testing living organisms in soils, like I've just pushed into this in the last 2 years. And it's like, Adam, when I first started in 2005 with Gergich, like I took all these soil classes and I knew so much about soil science. A decade later, I knew less, but not because I forgot it, but because the industry has taken off, right? There's so many people out there that realize you can make money off this stuff, right? And so I always tell people, be wary of compost teas, because you can probably make them better than you can buy them. And some of them I think are just not high quality. So be mindful in how your approach, and don't like go broad first, right? Like try to understand big picture stuff. Don't drill into just like kelp or seaweed or compost tea or, cover crops. You need to have like a broad approach to it. Because then you can see like that bigger picture, right? And I think that's the thing that I get so excited about is, if you go to if you and I were here in Michigan, we'd be sitting at the Bos Wine Garden in the back, and we've got this amazing garden. And you and I could just walk around. Like I do this with people all the time. We have all the biodynamic prep flowers growing there. We have a ton of other flowers and trees and plants too, but like the nettle just takes off. I've cut it back 3 or 4 times. Like what a great free resource that I've turned into nettle tea, used it on the vineyards. I drank some of it because it's delicious, put it on compost piles. So you can do a lot of this pretty easily. And if you plant nettle, and it will take off, like you may want to put it in a garden box, because if not, you may have more nettle than you know what to do with. I've done this numerous times. And once again, I did it again, where I've got this huge patch of nettle that I got to cut back again before it like encroaches on and I've got to tell small children not to touch it. Right. Cause it's
right.
Because it has but you look at nettle as a plant, right? Simple. Nettle grows everywhere, right? I remember it as a kid, like walking through the woods and being like, something bit me. And you're walking through this nettle patch. And if you look really closely at those like little spikes that like hurt you, all that is a silicate process that's defending the plant.
Yeah.
The silicate process, and it's amazing how many places it is in nature. So you can take nettle tea, and it's going to be very rich in iron and silica and some of the other micronutrients that you need for a vineyard. And it does some of them so well. Also, silica is, beach sand. It's also in your organs, your eyes. Like you can't, like the silicate process is in human or animal form, plant form, and in soil form, right? The process is similar. You can easily harness that process and do things really positively in your vineyard, and it costs you almost nothing. The other thing I would say is when you look at some of these processes, right, like you have to understand the concept of silica, because you could go buy it and it may not have the same results. My favorite thing in the world is if you've ever done a petiole sample, they test for silica and they never find any. It's one of the things they test for. You want to know why they don't find it?
Why?
It's the silica is in the plant, right? If you pinch off the end of the vine and it scabs over, that's the silica process in the grapevine. It's going to defend once there's a tear, a rip, or something going on. So the only time you're going to see silica show up is if the vine gets damaged.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like that process of things damaging vines, whether it's a fungus, an animal, whatever, is pretty likely to happen in your vineyard. Don't you want that process to be as strong as possible, even if it's not something you can measure on a petiole? Because if your silicate process in the plant helps build up the cuticle, helps protect the clusters as they're going through softening or veraison, right? It does all these things, and we know it, but we just kind of go, well, we can't really test for it very accurately, so who cares? It's like, well, I do, because it's one of the biggest things you can do to make your vine stronger in both the short and long term of a vine's life.
Yeah. Lovely. Do you guys have any herbivores besides deer that you have to worry about for vineyards there?
Yep. So deer, raccoons are the worst with 4 legs. We also get starlings here.
Oh yeah.
And they're like, you got to net certain vineyards or you're not going to have a crop.
Yeah.
I've looked at like falconeers, and we haven't planted a vineyard yet because we've been focusing on everything else. I've planted a lot of vineyards for other people, which is fun, but we'll get there. Hopefully the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be able to buy a property and plant a vineyard. But one of the things I want to do, like, dream scenarios, right, is have a vineyard that has a full-on working farm, right? Like has a bunch of other stuff going on too, whether it's apples, livestock, etc. Right? Like my dream farm, it has a vineyard, but it's not only a vineyard, as you would probably imagine. The Pyrenees mountain dogs, like I want to get them because a friend of mine at Up North Heritage has them, and they have chickens. These things chase everything off. The female dog will bark at airplanes. It's like, you're not landing here, right? So I think by using dogs, if you train them to chase starlings, you're not going to have a lot of starlings. And I would much rather like feed a couple of really fun dogs that help protect your crop than spend a lot of money on plastic nets, but I haven't tried this theory out yet, but I do think it would work.
Yeah, no, I think about that too. Yeah. And also cats, maybe, depending on.
Not for deer though,
Not for deer. No. I mean, you'd need the dogs and the cats as long as they grew up together and got along well.
Oh yeah, yeah. The dogs love the cats that are on the farm, but
Oh, nice.
like anything
Nice.
else, like you don't like. They've never lost a chicken to a coyote. We have coyotes too, or a raccoon or possum. Like these dogs are just like they're working dogs, and they're awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, you mentioned Maria Toon's book, Gardening for Life. Were there other
Yeah,
books, other resources you said you love?
yeah, for sure. That's one that I would say it's a great picture book, but it's also very informative. From Sky to Earth by Nicholas Jolie is a fun read if you are into wine
Okay.
and you're like, hey, I just want kind of an overview. And he goes off the deep end several times, but I've always enjoyed that book from if you're love good wine and you want to hear a good story, right? And then one that really helped me understand the preparations and plants like yarrow and nettle and horsetail and all the things, right? Is Peter Proctor's Grasp the Nettle. He's New Zealand, Australia, does some work in India, but he does just a really good job of taking it and talking about like how silica works and potassium works in living plants. And I think that's where if you just study it on the chemistry side, you'll understand it a little bit. And it's good to have that background too, right? Like if you can take any classes online or with like how a vine functions is really good. Like you should do that, but then also realize that there's other ways to get nutrients to plants. One of my favorite authors is Infred Pfeiffer. Um, he has the How to Grow a Garden and Be Self-Sufficient. It's a book he wrote about companion planting in the 40s for the Victory Gardens. It's a great read, but he like if you do any gardening, like his stuff is gold on that. But he also has what is his soil book called? Shoot, I'm gonna have to look it up. It's an orange cover. It's probably my favorite book if you are coming from a chemistry side because he studied with Steiner but was here in the 40s and 50s, and so he came up with these field sprays, a field spray and a compost spray, because he wanted to not compete with what people were buying, but he wanted to make it super simple and applicable for the larger farmer, smaller farmer to be able to buy a product, right? Because that's what they wanted to do at that time. Buy a product, mix it with some hot water, and spray it on their vineyard and have the same results as the biodynamic preps because it has all the preps in it. Also, the compost starter. If you've got a backyard compost pile, buy a unit or two, spray it on there, and it works. It works extremely well. I've seen it work for 20 years with amazing results. But he came up with that, and I'll think of the book. But that's kind of like the next level. But I would start with the Peter Proctor book. If you've noticed, I have not mentioned reading Agriculture by Rudolf Steiner.
Oh yeah.
And the reason for that, I love the book. I had to read it in a group setting because guess what? I grew up in the Midwest, went to public school. He's talking to a bunch of like high Germans in the 20s that all kind of understood what he was talking about. So he doesn't really explain, he doesn't go into a lot of background. So unless you actually like are there at that point, it's great. But like,
It's almost like a reference thing where you'd need to like study other materials to be able to understand that one.
yes, exactly. And so I just wouldn't say start with it. I'm not against it altogether. I just think
Yeah.
it's
Have you read
so many people
Have you
start.
read Monty Walden's book, Biodynamic Wine?
Yes, that's a great resource.
Okay.
I find it. I still go to it every once in a while. Does he have a new updated one? Because that was several years ago now.
That's a good question.
But
I don't
his
know
the
for
intro
sure.
to that book is really good too. He does a good job of explaining some of the preps and stuff. Um, the One of the Pfeiffer books is Biodynamic Farming and Gardening.
Okay.
That's a good one. I'm not. Oh, Soil Fertility. There we go. Gosh, sound like such an idiot on your podcast. Soil
Not at
Fertility
all.
by Infred Pfeiffer is one of the ones that once I read some of these other books, it really hit me. And it's a book that like if you were trained in biology or chemistry, like you're gonna like it because he had a PhD and he explains it like he's talking to people that like learn the NPK system, right? So he
Yeah.
breaks it down that way, so it's pretty helpful that way as well. Also, like I mentioned earlier, jpi.org, they have a lot of these books. They do
Yeah.
conferences, they do workshops. They're in Virginia. Like I haven't been to one in 20 years, but it was so eye-opening and so cool to be there. And it's a good jump start if you're really wanted to dive deep. Is there's people doing biodynamics all over this country. Like there's a bunch of people in Michigan. When I moved here, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Get on those chat boards, get on those like group calls, or go visit biodynamic farms, because to see it is the thing that I think for me, reading about it is great. Like I'm an avid reader, but I'm also very much a doer, right? Like I gotta
Yeah.
the soil. I gotta like it's like when friends of mine that are studying for SOM stuff or WSET stuff call me. I'm like, well, let's go out and prune a couple vines, because if I can show you how to prune a couple vines, like you're gonna pass the test. If I tell you how to do it, it's kind of one of those things that it makes it really hard. Like,
yeah. Yep.
Learning different pruning styles is great in a book, but like until you do it, and it's great because every time I take people out, I just have pruning shears. I'm like, here, I'm going to show you on one vine, then you're going to prune the next vine. And they all get so nervous. They're like, what if I do the wrong thing? I'm like, in 20 years, no one's cut off too much. They always cut off too little, right? Like the thing is, you need to make all these cuts, and then I'll show you what you should have done. And then you'll start to see like what removing 90% of this vine looks like, right? If you were trying to quality grapes. And that's such a great way to learn, is by doing.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I realize the more I work with vines is like every vine is an individual too. It's like you can have guidelines and rules and training, but you got to get out there and kind of intuitively begin to, know how to work with individuals and not see it as everything. There's no like cut and paste vine. Every vine has a unique element to it, and you need to see them as individuals when you're working with them, handwork like that.
Well,
So
here's a thought process for you too that I try to put through all of everything we do in business, whether it's selling wine in Detroit or at the Wine Garden. And I'd be remiss not to mention our team is amazing right now. Elizabeth, Trinette, Betsy, and Jacob are just crushing it. And I think you need to have great people in this industry. So treat your people well, and then you have rock star teams that you get excited about working with. But one of the things we talk about all the time is there's a best way to do something, a good way to do something, a time you should probably avoid, and a time you definitely have to avoid. So if you look at it, and that's that fruit, flower, leaf, root day thing, right? There's a best time to do it. There's a good time. There's a time that's probably not great. And then there's a time you should avoid. So if you start putting things through that thing with pruning, then you go, oh, this is the best way to do it. And then you get to the next one, you're like, well, I don't have a best way. Do I have a good way?
Yeah.
Good way, and I don't have a cane for laying down. What's the least amount I have to do to make sure this vine's doing what I want it to do? Right.
Right.
I think so often we want to think in, zeros and ones, and it's like, well, farming is not zeros and ones. There's a best day to pick grapes, a good day, a day if you have to pick, you can. Like if there's a snowstorm coming, pick. And there's a day you can avoid it, definitely avoid it, And so I think if you have that mentality, like it has to be the same way. Like I had this vineyard that I was consulting for in California, and he was a mechanic by trade, and like, the nuts and bolts are always in the exact same spot, and you twist them exactly the same way. When he would prune, I would just watch his stress level go up. I'm behind him, and I was like, well, what if you need that? But I'm like, I don't need it now, so I don't need it later. That's what I would tell him. Because he's like, but that one was facing a good direction. I'm like, but it's one too many.
Yeah.
I can always remove it later. I'm like, yes, but let's not create work for ourselves, right? Like we have enough work to do in the vineyard. So pruning is definitely an art and a science. I think I also up here, you could take me to a vineyard, and I could tell you who pruned it.
Oh, fascinating.
People laugh at me, and they're like, I don't think you can. I'm like, let's do it. Like, take me to a vineyard. I don't know the people. If I don't know them, I can tell you right away. I don't know them. But if it's certain people, like I can tell you they're like, once you get to know pruning, you get to know a person's personality a little bit.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, any other hot takes? I mean, it sounds like Michigan's a really exciting place to be working right now.
It's excellent. And I'm so excited about being here. And I know you mentioned some of those other podcasts that I've been on that go a little more in depth, but I think we went deep and covered a lot of ground today. So I'm excited.
Yeah. And I should say I'm on your third wine that I didn't comment about. I've had all 4 of them and really love them all. I sadly don't have the red one next to me, but I'm drinking the Wildflower now, which to me Wishflower. Sorry, Wishflower. I'm reading it and thinking something different.
Yeah, Pinot
Mm.
Gris, Pinot Blanc co-fermented. This is where the farmer in me comes out, right? Like winemakers tend to like want to control all the variables. Where I look at it and go, I've got healthy, delicious Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. I want to co-ferment them and get a different expression. You've had the Rieslings. Riesling is definitely its own pedestal in Michigan. Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Gewürztraminer, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay can all make very delicate, beautiful wines here. And that was on lees for about 10 months. I fermented that in egg fermenters. And so for me, that wine is all about texture and beauty. And
Yeah.
it's such a fun wine to showcase how we can have these cold temperatures and sandy limestone soils and high acid, and you can end up with this like just really pretty delicate, aromatic, fun wine.
I love it. I mean, I'm, you know, this, please don't take this in any personal way, but not a huge fan of Pinot Gris. I mean, I just think there's too much of it planted, and most of it's not great when you taste it. But this is honestly my favorite that I've ever had. Where I mean, and I think doing it with the blend is fantastic. But really, there's this electricity on the end of this, and it's lovely. Yeah.
Well, and that's it's funny you say that because when I moved here, I'm like, I don't drink much Pinot Gris, and now I make like four of them because it's such a fun, versatile grape when it's grown well. And I think you know, that's the thing too, is like, if you're going to get into farming, do biodynamic farming, it gives you that it quality in wine, right? Like everyone I have ever met, it's like, why'd you get into wine? Oh, you had a certain bottle with somebody at some point, and now you're willing to work really hard, make less money to get that it wine back. And for me, when I was first into wine, like drinking a Domaine Zinhumbrecht, Hank's Gewürztraminer, Domaine Loire, and some of these wines 20 plus years ago when they were still somewhat affordable. The thing was, I'm like, there's something so cool standing behind this wine. What is it? And as I would look into it, most of them are biodynamic producers. So I think all the things we talked about in biodynamics. Yesterday, I was giving a talk, and the first question I said is, "Hey, raise your hand if you're growing grapes or working for a winery. Do you have a perfect vineyard?" All the hands go down. I'm like, "Good." That means you could use biodynamic farming in your life, because most people get to biodynamic farming because they have a sick vineyard or a vineyard that's not as healthy as they want, and biodynamics can heal sick vineyards. The other way people get into it, and you see this a lot in Napa or Bordeaux, it's Zinhumbrecht's a great example, like eighth generation, right, or something like that. He was born into these great vineyards. He didn't want good; he wanted great, and that's the other side. If you're trying to go from good to great in your farming, biodynamics
Mhm.
gives you that last 5%. So it can heal
Yeah.
vineyards, and it can also take you from good to great. And that good to great connects with a lot of people that go and buy $20 million property in Napa, and they have all the money in the world, but they go, hey, how do I get that last 3%? And it's like, well, it's actually a lot easier than, raising 20 million to buy the property.
Right.
And so that's always kind of how I look at it. I'm like, hey, if you want, you know, if you want good tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes are always better than store bought. But if you want great tomatoes and you start doing biodynamics and the silicate process of tomatoes, like you can have world class tomatoes in your backyard, you know. And
Yeah.
when we start looking at nutrient dense foods, you're only going to get there if you're composting, cover cropping, and working with things that are living to heal your soils, because that's where they're going to get that nutrient from, is the soil.
Yeah. That's lovely. Um, yeah, and I can taste that in this wine. I mean, it's like I said. I mean, I have found a lot of flabby Pinot Gris. I think that's why I don't
Mhm.
like it. And this is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Super crisp, minerally electric. Really nice. So well done on all of those that I've tasted. I mean, honestly, like I'm really, yeah, started my day well. Say that.
Well, and
Any,
That's
yeah, go ahead.
that's the thing too. It's like when you want to do this interview, I'm like, if we're going to talk Michigan, and undoubtedly I am, because I can't not talk about it, right? I love Michigan and what we're doing here. Like for you to be in California and not drink Michigan wines, it's
Oh
out of
yeah.
context, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I have been tasting more Michigan wines than expected lately. It's and not a bad one yet. So man, and I mean, guys are killing it. Um, love it. So any final hot takes or just profound insights that you've been blown away by lately in what you're finding there, doing what you're doing this time of year? We're in August.
I would say, no matter where you are, and I found this in the last couple years, And I think it's because I've been doing it so long, I've started to realize I love taking our team to the vineyard and seeing the vineyard through their eyes, right? So if you've been doing farming for long enough or winemaking, find somebody that's excited about it, that hasn't seen what you've seen, and try to re-experience some of their joys, because it's really life-giving to watch people pick fruit for the first time, do a punch down for the first time, prune for the first time. And I think for us to really move the organic and biodynamic movement forward, we have to be as inclusive as possible and be willing to teach at every step of the way. And so that's, I would say, in the last couple of years. And if you look at it, our Instagram feed is Bos Wine. Mine is Bos BD Farming, because when we opened the tasting room, Elena, who has Think Fresh Consulting, is a good friend of mine, but she's like, you can't do Bos Wine. I'm like, you said I was doing a good job. She's like, you don't respond to people. I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to do that all the time, you know? But if you look on there, like last year, it was like one of those funny pushes where like everyone's like, oh, it's your 20th harvest, we got to do something for it. I'm like, yeah, what we're going to do is promote everyone else that like is on our team and how they're seeing harvest, because that's way more exciting than some old white guy picking grapes for the 20th year in a row, right? Like that's no fun. So yeah, that Adam, I think, you know, some of the work you're doing with you know, interns and stuff like that, like be open-minded and enjoy life through somebody that's getting into wine for the first time.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. I more and more just want to, I mean, want to be of service. Yeah, that's
exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And boswine.com is your website as well, right?
Correct. And that has all of our wines, our story, all about our team. Also, all the different your podcast will get up there as soon as you publish it. So we've got other resources. The media page is pretty robust. Also, where you can find our wines in Detroit, Chicago, Michigan, etc. Also, come visit. We have 61 rivers and lakes. We've got a national lakeshore and Sleepyard Dunes, 60 plus wineries, amazing restaurants, amazing people. Like so many people up here are like, stop telling people about Northern Michigan. I'm like, oh no, I'm never going to stop telling people about Northern Michigan. I love watching people come here for the first time and look at Lake Michigan, like, oh, it looks like an ocean. I'm like, you saw it on a map, right? It's 60 miles away.
Yeah, it's a big lake.
Really
it's
deep.
A big lake.
Indians are really big. I'm like, yeah, it's a national lakeshore. But yeah, so I do think go explore Michigan wine, Northern Michigan, also Southwest. Like if you're in Chicago and you're not hitting up like Modalis, Stranger, like there's so many good wines down in the Southwest, and they've got so many cool things going on. I think so often people like want it to be like a Northwest versus Southwest, and I just see Michigan as like thriving in both areas and amazing people making amazing wine and cider in this great state. So visit, because you will find some really, really cool people making extraordinary wine.
Yeah, love it. Well, thanks again. Great. This is like we could continue to talk, I'm sure, about all kinds of stuff, but we'll do it again.
Yeah, reach out though. If you found any of this interesting, I love getting emails. Just we're about into harvest, so it might take me a while, but just keep bugging me.
Right on. Thank you for that.
Hey, thank you for your podcast. I've listened to numerous episodes and I've learned a ton. So keep doing what you're doing, because it's very encouraging for me especially when I'm in the middle of harvest and I need a little pick me up of people doing cool things.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. I'm so fortunate to get to talk to people like you. So thanks. Hopefully you'll be inspiring to some others as well. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes.